All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Vasily Romanov, and I am a senior designer at Smart Design. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to our Smart Salon. Tonight's discussion is on the subject of physical product development. And I'm joined this evening by three experts on the top, and my co-host, Rose Bloomberg, a senior project manager here at Smart. So for over 40 years, Smart has been developing physical products for humans. And with every project, we still can't predict every challenge that comes along the way. And the main reason for that is that humans are very complex human beings, while the product design process is often structured around rigid and linear stage gate processes. So acknowledging and navigating this tension successfully can either make or break the product. And I guess the question is, how do you keep the product development on track while leaving room for unexpected challenges and basically the serendipitous learnings? So our guests today live in the world of product development, and they're no strangers to such challenges. In today's discussion, we'll cover tools and tricks that allow design teams and product managers to transition these moments to panic into opportunities. So I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the project they're working on. Megan, why don't we start with you?
Great. Yeah, my name is Megan. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Rhea. And at Rhea, we are redesigning a medical device called the pessary. And the pessary is used to treat pelvic organ prolapse, which is a condition characterized, mostly affects women. And it's characterized by the weakening of the pelvic floor muscles, which allow the pelvic organs to descend out of place. And in this image, you can see, so the pessary has been around for thousands of years. The first reference to a pessary was made by Hippocrates. So very, very long time. And there is currently an exhibit of pessaries at the museum, and our pessary is there on the left, and kind of pessaries of yesteryear are there on the right. And you can see there's a long history of designing a lot of kind of scary looking devices to treat this condition. So, but the problem that we identified with current pessaries is that they are really rigid and stiff, which they're inserted into the vaginal canal. And that makes it really hard for people to insert and remove them on their own. And that has a lot of both health and lifestyle ramifications. And so our pessary is designed to collapse for insertion and removal, which should make both insertion and removal more comfortable, as well as easier for people to do on their own on more of a routine basis.
That's really cool. I didn't realize that your stuff was actually at a museum. You'll have to send me the link so we can check it out.
Yeah, you can see some of the original Frankensteins there in the back, which are taped and all kinds of stuff. But then the end device is 100% silicon, and you can see it there in the front. But pessaries of yesteryear were made from brass and glass, and the current ones are made from silicon, but they don't collapse.
Okay. Ingvar?
Hi, my name is Ingvar. I work at Logitech, where I've been leading the Logitech G gaming design team for a while. It's not really a specific project. It's kind of hard to talk about things that are in development. But obviously we work on a lot of things. I have to shout out Sito, who's actually in the audience. Thank you, Sito. He designed this headset here, the G435. And I think in many ways this exemplifies some of the challenges that we face. We designed and developed this while we were all in lockdown. And we've had to clear a lot of hurdles, both in terms of testing. This was kind of aimed at teens, and they obviously have sort of growing heads and so on. So we've had to sort of enter into this space where we're developing something for a group of people that we weren't super familiar with. in a situation that we were not expecting, and having to sort of tweak all of our processes and so on along the way. So and it was sort of just the beginning of a lot of change, I think, that's going to last as well into the future.
For sure. It's a very good point. And I didn't think that, I guess, designing around the heads that are actually growing for children, that's an interesting challenge in its own.
Yeah. Headsets are the whole, like, I brought this up because we deal with, actually, you look at some of our products and they're kind of, you know, accessories, but a lot of them have very, very, I'd say, specific ergonomic needs, as well as all, you know, like interaction needs and so on.
Okay. Thank you. Francoise?
Hi, everybody. I'm Francoise Viello. I'm a senior category director at OXO, and I'm going to be probably speaking to a lot of different items, which is why this image is a bit like general, just because we cover so many different categories. And so as we're getting through today's discussion, I might be like hopping around depending on, you know, the question at hand and what I think is the most applicable. But I would say that in general, we're always facing not only like how do we continue to keep our existing items new and fresh, but like how do we bring newness to the market, given that our brand is so prolific already in housewares especially.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that's probably a big challenge. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can kind of get out of that approach. So a little housekeeping. So there's a Q&A box for everybody attending at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to ask any questions. Rose will be keeping tabs on it today, and we'll submit it to the panelists at the end of the conversation. And there's also a chat window that I saw some of you already sending in chats and hellos. So feel free to kind of chime in throughout the conversation. And just be aware that this conversation is being recorded. And then the summary, along with kind of all the links, will be available in about a week on Smart Design's website. So I guess without further ado, let's kind of jump into it. And basically, as I mentioned in the introduction, Smart Design has been a leader in product development for quite some time now. And one of our critical strategies in product development is to connect with what people want and need, which often can result in kind of surprising findings. The challenge is that for myself, like as an engineer, I kind of fall in a category of like something works, don't fix it. But I guess depending on the circumstances, that may not always be a good approach. So Francoise, from your experience, can you talk a little bit about an experience that you worked through where kind of like that approach of if it works, don't fix it, did not work?
Sure. Sorry, it took me a minute to find the mute button. So
No worries.
yeah. So I would say, I mean, like this pops up every now and then, and it's very easy to take things for granted here at OXO when we do have so many products that you know, are really high quality that we can rely on. And so one of the experiences I can think about when sort of we were hit with this or up against that type of challenge is when we were trying to revive our existing angled measuring cup. So, you know, it's a patented item and it's been around for years and like, you know, pretty well known as a measuring device. And one of the ways we thought we could expand on it was by changing materials. And so we thought, okay, super easy way to go about it. We already know what the design looks like. So it's really just, instead of Triton, let's just make this out of another material. And the function we were trying to capture is the ability to microwave. So, you know, like right now with Triton, it's not as high heat resistant as say like glass or some other material. And so we thought about it and we were like, okay, the easiest translation could be silicone. So we just, you know, thought, okay, we'll take our angled measuring cup, the design's already made, and we'll just make it in silicone, boom, done, you know, like, you know, we can ship it like fairly quickly with just a very straightforward switch of material. So of course, when we started looking at the overall shape of our existing cup and what that would mean in that material, we discovered all of these challenges with regards to, you know, how is somebody going to hold this big vessel that's now like made of a squishy material.
Mhm.
And, you know, is it the best experience for the consumer to have this additional handle, and how's the handle going to be attached? Because right now the handle's a different material. And so all of these, like, there were little things that started to pop up. I shouldn't even say little, I should say big, because it was like larger issues started to sort of percolate based on something that we thought was going to be very simple. And so we had to take a step back, and instead of just thinking about like, how do we take our angled measuring cup and then just make it in silicone, which was what we were initially thinking, it was really about taking a step back and thinking about, okay, what does the consumer want in the scenarios that we're trying to address? And so if we are trying to say, okay, somebody can now use this in a high heat environment like a microwave or something, then, you know, the consumer, so silicone is still probably very good in terms of material, but maybe the shape is not what necessarily we need in angled measuring. Maybe the shape needs to be something different. And so as we were able to take that step back and think about really what the real problem was, as opposed to already jumping to what we thought the solution was, it opened us up to a lot more discovery, and we were able to look at the design, like relook at the design, and really pare back a lot of what we were trying to do, which eliminated complexities. It also introduced just some different features and functions that we ended up being super proud of. And now the item on the market, it's the silicone squeeze and pour. For people are like, what is she talking about? If you were to look up the OXO silicone squeeze and pour cups, you'll see that it's very different than the angled measuring cup, because we had to approach it differently based on the user scenario.
Right. And I think it's interesting that I guess a lot of the times you find kind of these design inspirations in very different places that you don't expect to. Like on a regular basis, I'm just walking around and like, oh, well, you know what, I can use this in some other place, or I can use that somewhere else. So I guess, but like you mentioned, like what user wants, one of the challenge for, I guess, designing for people is that we kind of as humans have the ability to adapt to different situations. Even if like products that we're using may not be that good. So Ingva, can you describe a scenario when one might want to reconsider eliminating like a flaw from a design for like the greater good?
Yeah, I think, well, it's one of those things as designers, right? We're like eternal optimists because our job is to solve problems. So sometimes we have a tendency to kind of make problems where we solve a problem, but then don't consider the fact that we may have created new problems in solving the problem that we set out to solve. And actually, the headphones that I showed earlier, we had a situation where early on in the development phase, we've we had the question come up, and this comes up all the time when we develop new products, was like, all of our functionality and the whole sort of user interface on the product is on the left-hand side. And it's on the left-hand side for a good reason. So when you're gaming, you're letting go of the keyboard, not the mouse. So you can still navigate and see what's happening around you and sort of react to it. But the question was brought up like, no, we should shift it to the right-hand side, because I'd rather let go of the mouse instead of my ability to move forwards and backwards. And so it just exemplifies, it's not a unique situation in many ways, right? But it just exemplifies this, like, sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because basically, because you sometimes don't give users time to like adapt to a thing, or just in some cases it's like, yeah, it was an experience that wasn't necessarily perfect, but then maybe no solutions are perfect. You have to kind of I think, just as designers, it's like you're always conscious of the fact that you're making choices along the way, and you try or at least we try and use this combination of, we create these foundational principles for how we want our different products to work, and we try and sort of stabilize the core functionality against that. But then we always, there's always some new piece of technology or some other constraints, right? In this case, with this pair of headphones, it didn't have all the functionality, or it didn't have all the same interface that our previous headsets did. So we had to kind of overcome and introduce the new functionality that we then had to figure out a way to integrate. So we always run up against those kind of challenges of how do you stabilize the core functionality, but then like figure out elegant ways of solving for the new problem, the new technologies, the new problems, solutions that you'll find, without doing it in a way that alienates your user base completely, especially because in gaming a lot of it is about, like it's about learning how something works, because I mean honestly there's no real intuitive solutions in our space, because it's all sort of pattern recognition things, right? And then you build motor skills around it, and when you've got those motor skills, for us to change it, it's got to be really good. So we spend a lot of time then sort of conceptualizing, doing peer reviews, and then doing user testing, and iterate on the user testing until we have something that we think works for most people.
Okay. And I have a feeling you're, as gamers, you users are very passionate about their products. So you probably get a lot of feedback on that as well.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the things that we've learned over the years, right? Not just in the gaming space, but just as Logitech as a whole, and also me as a designer, is that if you're going to change something significant that has a significant impact on how a product works, you've got to think really hard about whether you really need to do it, and then consider really well, like, how do you bring people along, like your user base along with you, right? And we'll know very quickly if we've done something that's like that people will need to adjust to again.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I guess kind of to another thing that I've always kind of been curious about. You mentioned user testing, and for consumer products, there's a lot of user testing that goes on. And in medical device world that I've lived in for a little bit prior to OXO, one of the challenges is that products cannot be tested on humans and get a lot of feedback until pretty much like the very end of the product development cycle. And at that point, the changes are so significant that it's so hard to kind of go back and start redesigning again. So Megan, I guess this question is kind of directed at you, but what are some of the challenges that you had to overcome developing the pessary, considering that such a critical device cannot be tested until you're done designing it?
Yeah, I came from designing and developing consumer products, and so this was I was very used to the ideate and come up with a lot of ideas, test a lot of ideas, synthesize, ideate, that approach, and being able to, even if the roughest stapled together prototype oftentimes could be tested, and that is definitely just not the case with medical devices. So for our device, we still did a lot of user research, and we basically we have two kind of main consumers. We have doctors who prescribe and fit the device, and then the women who ultimately use the device. And we basically from the get-go, we're just alternating back and forth between them. And with the doctors, they have usually doctors who fit pessaries have fit hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pessaries, so they know the dynamics of the environment. I guess another challenge is that as is true in many areas of women's health, the vaginal environment is not particularly well studied. And so even a very basic force or number you would want as an engineer is the force that the device is going to be under. And that is not like a known quantity. And so we basically relied on the experience of doctors, and we would do the same thing where we would present them with the device and we would ask, do you think this is going to work? And then we go to women and we would ask for their perceptions of the device, and we could test the ergonomics and interactions. And we went back and forth with those two things to kind of narrow to two designs. And then we actually built a mock vaginal environment in order to run and more engineering test. And so we had this box that we made, and then we molded the different body parts. So we molded like a vaginal canal. We had like a balloon as a bladder. We had foam that was like representing different muscle groups. And then we put a weather balloon in the top and sealed it off. And then we could pressurize the weather balloon. And that is kind of simulating like a cough, which is the highest force that that we expected the device to undergo. And we could see like if it stayed in place. And so that was kind of the set of things that we were going alternating between to get to a place that we hoped would work. But then, yeah, to your point, to then get to the place where we could test it clinically. So we were shooting for the most basic clinical trial, which isn't enough information even for our submission to the to the FDA. But we were looking for a trial where patients who already use pessaries would come in for their regular pessary maintenance appointment, would have their pessary removed, our pessary put in, they would walk around the office, they would give us, we would make sure it generally works, and then they would take it out and they would get their regular pessary and go back home. But to get to that point, we had to identify a manufacturer, mold the thing, find the silicon supplier. We ran biocompatibility tests. So that leap was like a leap of faith to some degree to ultimately make sure that the device worked. And we did make small changes following that first clinical trial to like sizing and like the different proportions, but the general design was successful.
That's a lot of work there.
It's
it's
not
really
that
amazing.
much more work. It's just, it feels high risk, I think, is the situation.
It's really amazing how creative you can get when trying to test without humans, when you really need a human to test with. Just a side note to the audience, this is just a reminder as we go to please put your questions in the Q&A chat, and I'll make sure to get to them a little bit later. I've seen a few come in, but don't hold back. But I guess back to the topic. I think, this makes me think about how it's really hard to ignore how COVID has directly impacted the physical product development cycle. And I know that a lot of us are sick of hearing about COVID and how it's impacted all of us. But I think, as a design group in an industry, we've really been trying to work around this and still get user feedback and get products in people's hands. Because it really is such an integral part of our process. And I think it is probably one of the larger challenges we as an industry have faced in recent years, I should say. I think, Ingva, if you could talk a little bit about how Logitech has shifted some of their processes due to the lack of consumer interaction, maybe whether it's at store shelf or generally like getting user feedback on your devices.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like COVID has sort of changed a lot of things for us. But in some ways, maybe a better way of describing it is that it's accelerated probably changes that would take 5 years to a decade to change, squeezed it into like a year and a half or maybe even less. We went into the pandemic with, like not really knowing what was going to happen. And then quickly people realized that they needed our stuff. But they couldn't go to the stores, they couldn't, and we simultaneously as a team, as a design team, we all packed up and went home and had to figure out how we work together as a team. I mean, just, this is a fairly large organization, right, of designers. It's not just in gaming, but the design team overall, and it's global and everything. So while we were pretty good at Zoom and sharing things digitally and all that, it just accelerated everything. And then came the questions of how do we test things? How do we develop things? But at the same time, what was happening in a different part of the organization was really something that was I think this longer term is going to change. It's changed how we're working in many ways. And I think it's going to change design in a slower, more profound way over the years. really how people are shopping for and buying things. Like in our world, like we were pretty, I would say globally, had a big presence in a lot of retail, like Best Buy and you know, like where consumer electronics are sold, and that was really a big way for us to sell things. But all of that sort of switched to direct to consumer. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it has kind of accelerated that shift. And I think with that, sort of not to lose track of your question, but with that, we needed to like, it started kind of with like, well, you know, that means that it's an opportunity for us to change packaging and our approach to how we package things so that we don't double pack and all those things. It's had a real impact on just how we sort of ship, and maybe in some cases think our first consideration isn't how things turn up on the shelf, but more about how they turn up in your mailbox or from delivery systems, or how that out of box experience works. But then as we started going through this, it also became really clear that, you know, the channels that you're now turning up in they have different opportunities and they have different requirements, but just basically because of how they work, right? So think about, you know, like social media is a big place where you find products now. A few years ago, that wasn't necessarily a thing. And for us, it just means that it's meant that we've needed to be much more specifically and tuned in with who we're designing for, because ultimately on the marketing end, the stories that we build and how the products are getting sold in channels where you can target super specifically, like where people live, what their interests are, and so on, right? So we're trying to kind of, the way we're looking at, sorry, there is a point in here. The way we're looking at design now, right, is really about arcing together and threading together our knowledge of like things like segments and user profiles that are really useful for designers to kind of like, how do you design for a lot of people without designing for yourself, and then taking that knowledge and sort of making sure that you're able to kind of thread it through into marketing stories, and that it also is the people that you design for, also the people that you market to at the end of at the other side of that sort of process. It sounds really simple, but it definitely isn't, because, you know, like product development of our products takes anything from 1 to 2 years, and maybe more in some cases, right? So things can shift and so on. So yeah, so I think that's kind of how we think about, or how we're starting to think about design.
Yeah, I think, you know, pre-pandemic, a lot of this we were already starting to think about, especially with social media becoming such a huge influence on how people are shopping and purchasing product. But with everyone sort of having to go inside, it became even more prominent. So it's definitely been interesting to see how different companies have reacted to that quick shift, I'll say, as opposed to like letting things happen a little bit more naturally. I know, Francois, we've had many conversations about this. Another thing I think that we've heard quite a bit about with COVID relating to product development is supply chain backup. And, you know, so many different reasons why this has, you know, become a huge issue. But I know, especially with OXO, Francois, this has been something that your teams have had to deal with, you know, from day one. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how it's affected OXO, and then maybe a little bit how you've adjusted your process also to manage some of these backups.
Yes, I mean, it's funny because I don't think global supply chain is anything that people thought they would be talking about so much. Right? Like, it's like, if you think about your day-to-day life, you're like, nobody's talking about this, but now everybody's acutely aware of like what's been going on. And so I would say that for us, it has definitely been a challenge, just because, you know, I mean, because the way that our business is set up, it is very global. And in terms of like where we tend to source in Asia, there have been a lot of setbacks there just given COVID, and then given, so COVID caused like, lack of labor. It also caused lack of supply of certain items, but then it also sort of on the flip side, created a larger demand for all of these things. And so while the supply was being drawn down, the demand was building up, so that even when the supply was able to turn back on, kind of exploded. And then there were all of these competing factors with like, companies trying to scramble to get as much as they could so that they could then, provide for their customers and consumers. So for us, a lot of it was planning on like all levels. So not just from a product development perspective, but like working with our supply chain managers and our demand and supply managers to understand, where there was the biggest risk. Also working with them to determine like how we prioritize just like what's coming in, because most times existing product and new product are competing, like even in like a sort of a normal scenario. But once you have limited resources, especially from the vendor side, you kind of need to be able to prioritize what you'd like for your existing vendors to do. Do you want them to continue to get existing product out to you, or do you want them to focus their energies on new product? And so having to weigh that is pretty challenging, because existing product is something that is important in short, mid, and long term, but obviously new product is what keeps your pipeline active. And so for us, it was all about like being able to prioritize across those things. Also being able to sort of be nimble in Asia, because different parts of Asia were being hit at different times. And so we luckily have resources there that are part of our company, where we were able to work with them to help with some of that flexibility. So when it came to new product, like having people over there that could speak on our behalf, or test on our behalf, or even do like checks on our behalf was very important. And then just here, being able to prioritize with our sales team and with our supply and demand teams, like what we should be focusing on, was super important from just from a business perspective, really.
Yeah, I mean, I know I personally didn't think necessarily about having people there to like man, the lines and different things. But when you think back about it, there's so many different factors that go into play with the supply chain backups. So it's kind of, I think in the moment we were all kind of like, just like, how do we navigate it? And it felt like everything sort of shut down for a moment. But in reality, like these things weren't really stopping. They were just, to your point, building until everything kind of exploded and opened back up again. And then, different things going on in Asia, like whether it was the Olympics or other things happening, I think also probably affected you guys as well, correct?
Yeah, I would say COVID, and then having something like the Olympics in China, where like they're a global force, right? And so there are certain areas where they want to ensure that, like from a global stage perspective, their environment looks as clean as possible, especially if they're hosting a lot of different countries. They want to make sure that like athletes are safe, that their people are safe. And so, there are a lot of things that were also just potentially like artificially shut down, even outside of COVID, that, put even more stress on the system.
Yeah. So interesting to hear. I think that while COVID was obviously one of the larger unexpected hurdles we've all had to overcome, or still working through, I should say, it's not the only reason, we have to deal with some unexpected things being thrown our way. Sometimes it's navigating a new industry, dealing with government agencies. There's just so many things that can go a little bit haywire when it comes to the product development process. I think Megan, as someone who went from working more in house goods, home goods, sporting goods, and physical product development, being able to test with people. You know, you've been working on creating this medical device, and you've been learning how to work with government agencies, doctors' offices, a lot of new things, I'm sure. This is maybe a multi-part question, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how you and your team approach the process and how you guys are also planning for future testing and how you know when to tackle it now and later.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a massive learning curve. Like, I think if I did it again, it would go a lot smoother and probably a lot quicker. But yeah, to your point, like our company is funded on a grant from the NIH. And so it's about the opposite of working with what I understand working with the venture capital is like. We applied for our grant, I think in April of 2018, and we received it in January of 2019. So 9 months later, and that was the first grant. It was a small grant that was basically just for like a proof of concept. So it was about 4 months worth of funding for us. And we're a small team, we're 4 people. And then we applied for the second grant, which is kind of the larger grant that's supposed to get a medical device through the testing and to the FDA submission. And we applied for that in April of 2019 and heard in April of 2020. So about a year later. And so those sorts of timelines are just the benefit, I think, of grant funding is the time. There's a different kind of pressure, but the timelines are like also very different. And then, yeah, on our team perspective, like we all, I guess none of us have developed a medical device before. We have a doctor on our team who has worked as a physician for 25 years. And we have 3 people with engineering backgrounds, none necessarily in medical devices. And so I think the learning curve of learning how to work with the FDA, what the testing requirements are going to be like, that feels like the thing that if I could do it all again, we would do a bit better. But one of the things that the FDA offers is a meeting called a pre-submission meeting. And the idea of the meeting is that you can talk to the FDA before you go through all your testing to confirm that this is indeed the test that they're looking for. But you send your questions in and then they get back to you 3 months later. And so the extent to which you are excited to ask those questions is like, they have to be good ones, I guess. Yeah, so there's that kind of component. Then on the testing front, we kind of like got this laundry list of tests back. And I think the mechanical testing we were like very accustomed to, could understand, had like a good understanding of. But I think the real leap, even the clinical trial actually is like very straightforward. I think the leap for our team was really in the realm of biocompatibility testing, because we don't necessarily have toxicologists on staff. And that is where I feel like we've really been playing this game of figuring out when to parallel path things and when things need to go in a certain order. So the biocompatibility tests are extremely expensive and quite long. And so we're kind of constantly playing this game of, if we, so we have these 8 tests we need to run. If we ran them all at the same time, then that would be the quickest way to accomplish them. But if one fails and it requires us to rerun 2 more, then that's going to like lead to a lot of costs. And the way we have generally gone about doing that is we have a big map of all of the tests that need to run, and basically they're links to one another. And there are, in each kind of on a case-by-case basis, we see like if a test is relatively inexpensive, we will parallel path it with other tests that are dependent on it. And if tests are really expensive, we wait. And so sometimes we're making a timeline sacrifice and sometimes we're making a cost sacrifice. But those are kind of the 2 factors that we're constantly balancing as we understand like what all these tests are and get them going.
I think that's in some ways fascinating, but so also problematic. I think the anecdote you told me when they were asking you to redo a test for the color change that you were discussing, where
I mean, the color is like, the amount of effort has gone into making this device a nice color is extraordinary. I'm not sure I would do it again. I think a standard color might be, but coming from the world of consumer products where brand is important and you want like the entire experience to be a good one, we were kind of like, without a doubt, we want this to be this certain color. But the process of like, we're running all these tests on a material that is a medical grade silicon, meaning that it has already the raw material has had all of these tests run on it. And we are running them again to show that the process of molding our device is not like affecting those exact same tests. And yeah, the color is, if we were to change the color down the line, we would run all these tests again. And so yeah, that's one of those things that we set in stone. That was like one of the first things we set, and we've gone through a few different, as we've like really needed like a very basic brand early on, and then we got into packaging and needed like a little bit more to work with. And the one thing we were like, you cannot change the color of the device. Like this, it took like 6 months to get the color to arrive. Like that kind of got set right away, because that's one of those that affects all of the timelines and all of the costs.
Great. That's interesting. Just one thought that I was thinking about, Francois, just kind of going back to you were talking about earlier. You mentioned this, like having to sacrifice future product development for the needs of the existing product. So can you talk about how as a company you choose to prioritize existing product development versus new product development?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's definitely something that in the past we haven't had. Before pre-COVID, it wasn't as big of an issue because there was enough resource to kind of go around, especially on the vendor side. But when COVID hit, it became much more challenging because we had limited labor resources there, and sometimes materials even just to do like pilot runs and things like that. And so I would say that for us, it was really about thinking about like sort of the urgency of certain things. And so during COVID, I would definitely say that existing product took priority just because it was almost a competitive advantage to continue to be able to supply our customers with product. And so we were able to, because we focused a lot on existing product and making sure that our shelves were stocked with our product, we were able to not only keep our own business running, but we were also given some additional opportunities to gain additional space, because when a competitor wasn't able to supply and OXO was reliably, then we would gain that space. And so if you continue to build relationships and if your customers can continue to rely on you, that actually shores up your relationship for when you then go back and you're talking to them about new product. Obviously, like one of the big challenges is, okay, but if you stop working on new product, and then do you end up with this huge gap, right? Because a lot of the new product development is kind of planned. You have this pipeline and you're planning years out. And so if you sort of put the brakes on some of the new product, it's like, okay, are there going to be gaps that are going to appear in the future? And the short answer is like, possibly, yes. But it's one of those things where you kind of have to then just decide, do we risk it? And are there things that we can do that would fill the gap that maybe aren't as resource intensive, like sets and things like that, and like sort of additions to existing lines that are easier to implement and to roll out versus like new product, which takes a little bit longer in development. So there were different things that we had to think about in terms of, okay, we'll end up having to push this launch date out for a new item in exchange for being able to continue to have these the existing product on the store shelves. But I think that the relationship building aspect of that was so strong that it's definitely worth it.
It's interesting. So can you tell yet that like that kind of bet is paying off already, or is this something you're hoping to see in the future?
Well, it definitely paid off during the COVID. Yes, like we've definitely seen increases just in terms of like the opportunities that we've been given based on the fact that we were such reliable vendor partners with our customers. And so definitely it's paid off like during COVID, and it's continued to be just paying off just based on the opportunities that we're getting to add in things that maybe some customers weren't taking in the past that now they're taking. And so we've definitely seen it. I think that, you know, like come to me 2 years from now when you're like, okay, what does that pipeline look like since you had to push some of your new product, you had to shift it to the side. And then I may have a slightly different story to tell you about, like in terms of like the launches. But we did already as a team discuss items that we could use to fill the gap, given the fact that some things are going to have to shift out.
We might have to bring you back in a couple of years and ask the same
Say,
question. See, hey, how did it go? So I guess thinking it for future planning, I think one of the challenges, especially I guess it's for technical companies, is that technology just changes drastically so quickly. And I know it's across different industries. It's like I follow automotive industry has that challenge. Anyway, you mentioned that you have that challenge as well. So can you give us some of your thoughts on planning for like the rapidly changing tech and like us humans trying to keep up with it, if we can?
I think, well, I think we talked about it a little bit, you know, like COVID has changed a lot of things. I think it's also brought a lot of things into focus. And I think, you know, what Francoise, what you were talking about, I feel for you because we've been going through the same, and it's still sort of going through the same things, right? You have to make choices along the way. But I'd say, like, as it relates sort of to design and probably, you know, the whole company, especially in the CE space, right? Is that with the rapid change and the sort of like the exponential change that's happening in technology in general, largely driven by the digital shift, right? The more interesting part of it for us is seeing how it's accelerating also a change in sort of generations. So a lot of what we're looking at, right, is the shift from non-digital native consumers to digital native consumers. Now, we've talked about it probably for more than a decade, but now it's really happening. The challenge with it, it's kind of hard to identify a point when it's arriving, and it probably never will be, right? So it's so the question we're asking ourselves is like, how do you prepare for serving both sort of non-digital native consumers and digital native consumers in a way that feels authentic to you, how you as a brand, and that sort of, you know, captures the sort of moment, as it were, of new technologies coming in. And it puts a really big responsibility on designers, I think, in general, right? Like doing that responsibly. I think in some ways it's like the way I look at it is that you have to move fast to move slow. So meaning you have to move fast to kind of capture the knowledge of who your user base actually is, and then create platforms like technology platforms that you can then live with for a longer period of time, right? That you can through digital, through user interface and sort of upgrades, hopefully kind of they will keep relevant, stay relevant, because, you know, in some ways the human form hasn't changed and won't change for the, you know, foreseeable future. And so there's a certain, like when you do a lot of products that are like very about comfort and about performance and stuff and about ergonomics, like, you know, like humans aren't going to change, but the technology that we use is going to change. So I think there is that sort of aspect to it that we try and sort of build platforms, both in terms of like the products that can be upgraded and can be, the design doesn't fundamentally change necessarily, but it gets better over time. We may do versions of it. You'll see that in some of our products. But it also means like doing fewer bigger things and fewer things that makes more sense, right? Like collections of products. I think, Francois, you mentioned that as well, definitely is something that I'm a big advocate of, instead of sort of spread betting with a lot of different products that consumers have a hard time making sense of. It's like, in order to capture people's attention now, with all the sort of things that are going on from a technology point of view, you have to be really clear about what your products do and what you stand for as a brand. And I think in the extension of that, right, which is something that we've been working on for a while. I think COVID has also really brought this into a real clear, sharp focus, is efforts around sustainability. So while you've got all this change going on, that you're not losing sight of how you're gonna do better in order to serve sort of the planet Earth better as well. So that's definitely, and I'd say we're getting better. We're using a lot of post-consumer recycled plastics, and we've got carbon labeling we're starting to roll that out across our products, and being transparent about that and trying to drive that in the industry. And but it also, I think, from a design perspective, what's happened in the last few years for us that's really come into focus is that you're not designing for yourself, right? So that whole focus of serving, which is something we have in our mission statement now, it's serving all gamers, right? And it ladders us up to a bigger sort of mission statement for the company of serving everyone, and building that in when you've got changing technologies, making sure that you're serving all different consumers. Means that you need to rethink your processes, how you approach design work, and you need to be really clear about who you're designing for at multiple, sort of in different categories or different products.
Interesting. I think also, like, going back to your generational comment about how you kind of have to design for different generations, just like an anecdote out of my world is my wife works as a teacher in a high school, and to me, high school students are all absolutely, wrapped into like social media and technology and phones and everything. But apparently they are complaining about how elementary and middle school kids having access to technology way too soon. So like you have high school students at this day and age complaining about how elementary and middle school students are apparently, having technology accesses too soon. So there's definitely a challenge there that you kind of have to think about.
And I think it extends also into the people, like, as the digital native generations kind of come into the workforce, we get like, it really it forces you to reckon with it really, really clearly internally, because they will tell you that you don't get their generation, basically, and that you have to be proactive about engaging them, about designing for them, about testing products with them to stay relevant.
Yeah, it can also keep us young too.
Hopefully.
All right. So I think it's a good time for Q&A. Rose, do you have something you can share with us?
Yeah, we have a few questions from the audience. I think I'll start with the first one that came in, which was directed at Francoise and Oxo. I think this was in regard to the discussion around the silicone measuring cups. But I think maybe we can make it a little bit more of a two-pronged question about maybe the choice for immediately wanting to go with silicone for that product in the part of the original design brief, and then also like whether Oxo is considering more sustainable materials, whether it was for that product or maybe as we move forward into the future.
Yep. So I'll cover the first question, the first part of the question first, and which is just around like why choose that material. And it definitely did stem back from the brief, which was around the fact that we wanted an item that was like had high heat resistance. It was specifically, this specific use cases were around like microwave use, so like melting butter and chocolate and things like that people can't do with our existing angle measuring cup. And so when we thought about that, and we thought about the fact that it would be nice to have it be flexible as well as high heat resistance, it starts to narrow down the field quite quickly. Food safe, obviously. So there were a lot of things that you kind of had to check off, and silicone ends up being like the clearest sort of item to use when you go through, like, I need it to be high heat resistant, I need it to be flexible, I need it to still have grippiness because somebody's going to be carrying this now flexible hot item. Like, I need to be able to mold in these features very easily. It would be ideal if it could be translucent to clear, because when somebody's looking through a measuring cup, in order to use like the different measurements on the outside, you want them to be able to see through it. And so once you started checking off all of those boxes, then the type of material really kind of rises to the top. So silicone is what we went for in that case. That being said, OXO's had a lot more activity around the sustainable space and environmental responsibility in general. We're one of the only housewares brands that has partnered with 1% for the planet, and that's a relationship that we established, I want to say maybe 2 years now. And so I'm not going to go into everything that 1% does, but I can say that just as an organization, they partner with for-profit brands to really generate revenue, activity, sort of visibility to a lot of sustainable efforts. And then they use the funding that they're getting from these for-profit companies to help with a lot of different environmental responsibility initiatives across the world. And so super excited to be part of that, OXO in general, but we can't just throw money at the problem. One of the areas that OXO's always prided ourselves on was durability. So like that was always our angle from the beginning. Like even before there was a conversation around sustainability, you can a lot of times we get customers that are like, I've had your can opener for 20 years. And so that type of stuff has been always really great. And that's really where we leaned in, is just durability. But there's always more that you can do. And so we've definitely started to look at if there are like recycled materials that we can use again in our products, if there are ways that we can make it easier for the consumer to recycle our own products when it does reach end of life. And so there's, I would say that in the near future, you'll definitely be seeing a lot more from OXO with regards to at least that post-consumer sort of recycling story, as well as different materials. Like we did also get into glass food storage, not just plastic food storage, glass bakeware, and items like that. So definitely something that's very important to the brand, and something that will continue to move forward with, both as like a developer of product and of consumer product, but also we have like internal sort of initiatives that we do just so that as employees and as people that are within this brand, things that we can do better just to support environmentally responsible initiatives.
Yeah, definitely interesting to hear how you guys have been tackling that. I think I'll throw this question over to Ingva. Maybe I'm being too literal, but I think the question came up about whether we think AR technology could be a type of digital way to user test products across the country. I know I have a lot of opinions about this, but I'll let you as our panelists answer them. So like the person who asked the question was talking about, for instance, being able to visualize the proportions of the product in real time in your space and the comfort of your home. Would it make sense, I guess, for Logitech to maybe enable some of these capabilities?
Yeah, I think in some cases it can. It absolutely can. I don't know if I would preface that by saying I'm not sure if really like the AR technology, where the focus has been now, really sort of more on like environments and gaming and stuff, is kind of there yet. I think they're really good. I think currently what I would say is like the logistics of doing that are more complicated than us actually sending products out by FedEx, and it's a lot more expensive and risky, and then you have to have someone like telling people what to do it. So we would only do it if the scale of what we were looking at would mean that would be a more meaningful way of getting input. You know, I know they use this a lot of in transportation design, right? Like in car design and so on, right? And also to a certain extent in sort of architecture, where it's really meaningful to be able to kind of see an environment. But for us, a lot of the things that, you know, like make or break our products is really about the feel, like the comfort, whether it's on your head, in your hand, or otherwise, right? That is so that tactility is so critical to get feedback on, even if it's just 3D prints that we're sending out. And we have, and it's got some risk. We've had instances of, you know, like having difficulties getting things back and stuff. So that it would be nice to be able
we're
to
familiar
switch
with that
it
as
off.
well. Yes, I know, like Smart Design and OXO too, we've been doing a lot of shipping around physical models in order to get things in people's hands, and the coordination alone of getting all these products back has been like a job in and of itself for sure. Yeah, I do think it's interesting, like AR technology in general. There's been so much advancement and yet lacking so much of that still for like real use in product development. Like that tactility is so important, and I have a hard time to imagining how helpful it'll be like fully to replace some of these things until that element is integrated, if it's even possible. But Megan, I think this would be a great question for you. So there's questions about the validity of using Dreyfus books or other ergonomic measurement books for basing some of our initial starts and designs off of. I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts around whether you think this is a good starting approach or whether it's go right to the people.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have, the only time I've ever used something like that was for like, we needed the product has a loop that is a feature that we use for removal, and we like wanted to know what the like 95 percentile or something size of a index finger would be, and that is like the kind of basic piece of information of like we're making a loop, like, and it needs to have a hole of what size, that I've like pulled that kind of information for. But I think like much more often again, this is like in the realm of tactile things that you can hold. I do not like want to speak for furniture or anything that is like maybe a little bit more like for a full body experience. But we oftentimes think about the kind of the extreme user that we are trying to, or for any ergonomic problem, who is like most likely to find this set problem most difficult. And this is like straight out of the OXO handbook. So for prolapse, prolapse primarily affects people after menopause. And so a lot of our users are like older postmenopausal, and a lot of people in that demographic have arthritis. And so we have, we're kind of constantly seeking, sometimes we need to talk to people who have prolapse and because of the questions we're asking, but other times we just need to talk to, say, someone who has limited dexterity of their hands. And so kind of with each set of questions that we're asking who the extreme user is for that like ergonomic problem is more the approach that I would say we have taken. I think even with that, like, what is the 95 percentile hand, I think we also confirmed that by finding the person who used to work or who still works at the Smart Design shop. His name is Ron, and Ron we think is probably in the 95 percentile hand demographic. And so we even still double check that like in person with a person. So I guess maybe like a good starting point, but there's like nothing really competes with actually watching people interact with the things. You just never know how they're going to hold it and what additional challenges they're going to have that you as a person, say with like less limited hand dexterity, would like never even think of.
I think we have time for one more question. And Megan, this one's directed at you as well. As a small team of engineers, how do you deal with the non-technical aspects of developing a product? And who decides whether they're going to be the one tackling branding, operations, supply chain? And then I guess when maybe you need to tap some external resources for help.
Yeah, we have a lot of, as our advisor says, we have a lot of consultants. And so I would say a lot of the realm that we're in right now, we have exited the realm of our necessarily previous experience. But one way that we tend to tackle these things is there are 4 of us, and we tend to have like a lead and a close support on each of these things. And so I think early on, we had to figure out a way to divide up the work so that we didn't have 4 people trying to do one thing. But that is one like consistent thing is, I lead the product development. My colleague Ari is like right there with me. And then on our clinical trial side, like the doctor that we work with, Paul, he's a member of our team. Paul, he works closely with our CEO, Caitlin. And in each realm, kind of you could work around and there would be 2 people who are really leading the charge there. But we still, use a lot of external consultants. And so we have one realm that obviously is very important for us that we knew from the get-go that we would need help with was a regulatory consultant. And in that case, I think there's maybe could be an argument for having that as a full-time team member. But we have instead, as a really small company, we have spent a lot of time ourselves in like the FDA's regulation books. And then we are kind of constantly using someone like a regulatory consultant as confirmation. And then I think in other areas, like in branding, we have a lot of experience with like a tangential experience. So we hired a packaging designer to help us with the layout and verbiage and illustrations for all of the packaging, and more importantly, the instruction packet. But we are still maybe the most knowledgeable people about the consumer that we're working with. And we conducted like all of the user research that went with that. And so I think in each case, there are realms that we are like very confident in. And then when Google kind of like falls short, that's when we like pull in an external consultant. I have sent like a lot of cold emails, and to the person who I think is going to know the answer. And I feel like that it is like quite amazing to talk to the person who has that deep knowledge in the very random thing that you're like trying to find. And that is like when all of the light bulbs go off. And I think at this point, we have enough experience that we can identify the answers to the correct answer. Like I always say, I'm not sure I could ace a fill in the blank test, but I'm pretty sure at this point I could conquer a multiple choice quiz. And so, pulling in the consultants who can kind of like lay out those things. They're coming at us left and right. I think Vincent asked the question, and I had to call Vincent earlier this week with an engineering question. So a lot of people helping this thing happen.
Yeah, I think having connections and kind of communicating with people, staying friendly with people, that's always a critical, no matter what you do, any kind of product development.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So I guess that would be it. So I thank you all for your time today. If you want to revisit discussion or share it with others, as I mentioned before, we will be posting this recording on our website, as long as with a summary later this week. We're going to be doing another of these series on Tuesday, April 19th. There's a link in the chat that you can reference. And that's all that we have for tonight. Just a little warning to all the panelists and participants, everything's going to end very abruptly. So we won't have a chance to say goodbye. So I guess everybody have a good night, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat with you guys soon in the future. All right. All right, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.